Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories. Help you relax and fall asleep. Ever wondered what happens when darkness falls and the rain starts? Stay with us to find out in tonight's chilling story. And comment where are you watching from and the time are watching this video. Let the gentle rain and these chilling tales carry you off to sleep. Sweet dreams. You're gonna give me $100 to sit inside this cardboard box for 2 minutes, I asked, feeling the booze slosh around my brain. It's that simple, the street performer said with a cocksure grin. You last 2 minutes inside the box. You get $100. What if I don't make it 2 minutes? You don't get $100. What's inside the box? The street performer opened the top of the large refrigerator box and, true to his word, was empty. So what's the catch, my friend? Paul said. There's always a catch. No catch. You go in of your own free will. You get out of your own free will. You put 2 minutes between those moments, you get $100. Let me see the money. The street performer didn't look like he had a spare Franklin to part with. He wore a stained, threadbare suit with patches on the elbows and tearing at the sleeves. Atop his head was a busted top hat that looked like it had survived since the Great Depression. His feet were covered in mismatched, filthy docksiders, looked like they'd been hauled up from some mucky swamp. That said, the street performer pulled a crisp and clean $100 bill from under his hat. I feel like if I go in, you're gonna kick the box or pour old soup on me or some other stupid shit, one of those dumbass TikTok pranks. Old soup? I asked, chuckling. Paul laughed. I dunno, man. Old-ass clam chowder or something. The street performer shook his head. No, sir. I'm not a fan of chowder or pranks, and I don't have any idea what a TikTok is. I'm just an honest man looking to give away $100 to the bravest and boldest among you. That's definitely not you, Paul, I said, laughing. Fuck off, bro, Paul said. You gonna do it? I asked. Why don't you do it? He shot back. Not bold enough? No, not really. Plus, if I sit down on the ground, I may not be able to get back up. I think I shouldn't have had that last drink. I'm gonna call that Uber. Your name's Paul, correct? The street performer asked my friend. Yeah. Paul, let me ask you this. Could you use $100? Hell yeah, especially after what I spent tonight. Big, brave man like you couldn't be afraid of a simple cardboard box? Fuck no, I'm not. Do you have 2 minutes to spare? How long until the Uber gets here? Paul asked me. 5 minutes, I said, give or take. Paul looked at the box and back to the street performer before glancing at me. What do you think? Is it worth it? Man, I don't know. I didn't. The alcohol was not only on top of me, but was beating my temples with rock hammers. I mean, the whole thing is fucking weird, but he hasn't explained a downside. I haven't informed you of any downsides because there isn't one, the street performer said with a wink. This guerrilla marketing for a box company, or do you work for Frigidaire? I asked. No, sir. I work for me, myself, and I, the street performer said. Nobody likes having a boss, am I right? Especially if you knew my boss, I said. He makes Attila the Hun look like Daffy Duck. Fuck it, man, Paul said suddenly. I'll do it. Wonderful, the street performer said. Only, Paul added, looking at me, if we can go to the titty bar after I get out. Bro, I am beat, I said, yawning. I don't have the energy. You don't have enough energy to look at boobs? No, I said, surprising myself. I might pass out in the Uber. If you're gonna throw up in the alley, Paul said. They charge extra if they have to clean up any bodily fluids. Maybe I'll puke in the box before you get in. Please don't vomit inside the box, the street performer said. It's one of a kind. These things come off an assembly line, Paul said, hardly one of a kind. I glanced at my phone, let my vision refocus, and noticed the Uber's arrival time. You got 3 minutes, dude. You going in or not? Fuck it, let's do it. Who keeps time? Time keeps itself. However, I have a pocket watch to assist us, the street performer said, pulling out a beat-up brass pocket watch from inside his suit jacket. Climb in now. I'll count you down. Paul opened the top flaps and placed one foot inside. He was unsteady on his drunk legs, and I started laughing at his teetering. H flipped me off, steadied himself, and placed the second leg inside. He sat down, shot me a shit-eating grin, and said, I want to go to Golden Apples after. That girl Janine is there this weekend. She's not into you, I said. Yet, he said with a smile before grabbing the flaps and closing himself in the box. Your time starts in 3, 2, 1, the street performer said, watching the second hand on his watch spin past 12. Go. Paul sat there for a minute before he started chuckling. I couldn't help but join in. What even was this? In a million years, I'd never be able to guess that this is where the night would end, inside a cardboard box. You start by having a few too many cheap domestics during a ball game and end up probably being hustled by an unhoused guy in a top hat. This is so fucking stupid, I said, barely holding back laughter. They said the same thing about the dog launched into space. Not very, Paul said, his voice muffled by the cardboard. He started a giggle fit again before adding, I feel like a dumbass. The shoe fits, I said. The box suddenly jostled violently. It went still for a beat before rocking back and forth again. From inside the box, I could hear Paul moving and adjusting. Bro, stop moving, I said. I'm not doing that, he said. 30 seconds, the street performer yelled out. Wait a second. It just got dark, really dark. You can't see the neon light from the bar? No, he said, his voice unsure. Wait, there's some kind of white light off in the distance. The distance? I asked, confused. You're inside a box. Farthest distance is a foot away. Hey, Mr. Top Hat, is there a screen hidden in here? Like a TV screen or something? The street performer ignored him. What's going on? I asked. There's something approaching the box. Yeah, the Uber, I said with a drunken laugh. No, there is someone walking toward the inside of the box, Paul said. It looks like a person, but that doesn't make any sense. His voice went from playful drunk to concerned drunk. He was sloshed, but a small part of his brain was still on guard. It told him there was danger around him, but it didn't make any sense, as he was sitting inside a cardboard box on the sidewalk of an empty street. 45 seconds. Paul, stop fucking around. Bro, I'm serious, he said. Some guy, I think it's a guy anyway, is walking toward me. Wait. Oh shit, there are 2, no 3? Fuck. 4. I'm surrounded by shadow figures. Shadow figures? I asked. They look like people, but different. You fucking with me? There aren't any features that I can see. They look like silhouettes. Dude, stop. The joke's not funny anymore. Get out, huh? The Uber is almost here anyway. Shh, he hissed. I think they can hear your voice. I turned to the street performer. What's going on here? What's the gag? He ignored me. His eyes stayed trained on the pocket watch's quickly rotating second hand. 1 minute. Halfway there, he yelled. I can hear them speaking. It's faint, but what? It doesn't sound like any language I've ever heard. Paul, enough's enough. Come on out, man. Our ride is turning down the street. Oh fuck, I think they saw me, he said, his voice quivering. Who's they? These shadow figures. Oh fuck, he said, fear lacing his words. I heard him start kicking the side of the box from the inside. Cardboard bent with each kick but never broke. Get moving, I said. I'm trying to run, but my body isn't moving. Dude, you're kicking the box, I said. That's not me. My body is frozen, and they're coming. Holy shit. Get out of the box, Paul. 1 minute, 30 seconds, the street performer yelled. Best time of the night. One of them is coming for me, Paul said in a panic. Oh God. They have eyes, but not like ours. His eyes, I can see. All trailed off. You can see what? Everything, he said. They're showing me everything. 1 minute 40. The money is as good as yours. Stranger. There's fire. It's everywhere. The ground is sizzling. I can feel the heat. It's burning me through my pants. Ah, fuck, what is this? Get out of the box now, Paul. The other 3 are closing in. Their eyes are glowing white. I can see the ends of the earth, the end of the sky, the end of it all. The fires, they burn. Oh God, they burn. Then Paul started screaming. Not, I stubbed my toe screams, but I'm being murdered. And the only person who will ever hear this is my killer screams. Open the box. I yelled at the street performer. Right fucking now. But he didn't move an inch. Kept his eyes trained on his watch. 10 seconds remaining. The street performer yelled. 10. I leaned over and tried to rip open the flaps on top of the box, but they weren't moving. They felt like 1,000 pounds, and I couldn't budge them. Slammed my hand down on the cardboard, and it felt like I had just hit concrete. My hand throbbed, but I tried again to rip the box open to no avail. Push up, Paul, I screamed at the top of the box. Listen to my voice and come for it. 9, 8, 7. Why are you all showing me this? Paul said through sobs. I don't want to watch them all die. Paul, sit up. Come on, man. Sit up. 6, 5, 4. Box was jostling back and forth, being shaken by unseen forces. It jumped an inch off the ground and rocked around like bored kids beat it with bats. I'm watching them tear me apart, Paul said with a whimper. Whoa. I'm above them now. I'm being pulled away, but I can see my body. There's so much blood, so much fire. Get out. What's pulling me into the air? Paul asked, his voice sounding distant. 3. Paul, I'm coming. I threw my whole body at the box, trying to knock it on its side. I hoped to see Paul come tumbling out, but when I hit the cardboard, it didn't move an inch. Clanged like it was made from pure steel. I braced myself on the ground and kicked the side of the box with all my might, and instantly felt a lightning bolt of pain rush my leg up and spine. There was nothing I could do. 2. I'm so high. I can see it. I can see the... Oh my God. No, it can't be. No. Paul screamed, and it sounded like it was falling now. Oh shit, the ground. It's opening. From the sidewalk, I looked up at the street performer with hate in my eyes and yelled, Let him go, you fuck. Open the box. I'm falling through the world. How? Oh no. Oh God, please let me go. 1, and time. The street performer yelled, raising his hands in victory. The box went still. Paul, you won, the street performer exclaimed triumphantly. Burst of the night. He calmly tucked his pocket watch back into his jacket pocket. He replaced it with a small dollar store confetti pop. He gently yanked the string of the popper and blasted bits of colorful paper and glitter into the air. It landed all around me. I lunged at the box and tried to rip open the top again. This time the flaps moved as easily as expected. When I pulled them back, Paul wasn't inside. Not a trace of him. The only thing I found was a crisp, new $100 bill. But, Paul? What the fuck? Where are you? He's left the box, the street performer said. His 2 minutes were up. I leaped onto my feet, ready to beat the street performer to a pulp. But when I glanced at where he had been standing, he was gone. I hadn't heard him run away or catch a cab or anything. Like Paul, there was no trace of him. It was like he'd never been there. From behind me, I heard a car downshift and come to a stop on the curb. There was the familiar whine of an electric window being rolled down, followed by a monotonous voice calling out my name. My Uber had arrived. I looked to where the box was, and it was gone too. All that was left was the $100 bill. You still want your ride? My driver said. Did you see anyone with me? No, he said. There wasn't a man in a busted top hat and a large refrigerator box standing here as you came down the street. I think you made a good decision calling an Uber, my driver deadpanned, adding, if you puke in my car, there is a cleaning fee. So if you're gonna yak, just do it now, huh? I felt my legs go weak. I didn't know what to do. My friend was gone, and the man who sent him away had vanished. I didn't even know what to say to the police. My friend climbed into a cardboard box and disappeared. No, I'm not drunk anymore. You coming or what? This is my busy time. I looked down at the $100 bill and something caught my eye. Instead of Benjamin Franklin's face staring back at me, someone had scrawled a note. I picked up the note and held it close to my face. I'd know that handwriting anywhere. It was Paul's. The note read, I've seen the end. You don't make it. Buddy, you coming? My driver asked. Yeah, I said. I'm coming. That was several hours ago. I've been sitting at my kitchen table staring at the $100 bill. I'm not sure what to do. My mind is mush, and it has nothing to do with the alcohol. I'm at a crossroads and don't know where to go. I don't know what to say to Paul's family. How do I even begin to explain this? I keep thinking I'm having a nightmare as I sleep one off, but I'm not. I'm sitting stock still in my kitchen as the first rays of the sun turn the black sky purple. There's a vice around my heart. profound loss for my friend and fear for the message he left behind. I've seen the end. You don't make it. You try falling asleep after this. If you think that was unsettling, our next story will leave you questioning what truly lurks in the darkness. I found a dog in my backyard with a camera on its collar. The footage makes no sense. I've never been a pet person, or a people person. My life is pretty much a storyboard of my favorite scene with small variations. Clean room, a comfortable chair, a good book, and even better scotch, and some classic rock from the vinyl collection I inherited from my grandfather. I get called boring frequently, and my sisters are always on my case about it, but it's my life, you know? I wake up in the morning when my body decides it's time. No alarms, no demands. I roll out of bed and head to the kitchen, where my French press sits on the counter. I make a nice breakfast, watch the sunrise while I finish my coffee. My house is on the smaller side, in a boring suburb, but I have it decorated just the way I like. 70s mid-century revival, tapered vintage furniture, geometric art, the works. I work from home as a consultant, analyzing data for companies that don't know I exist beyond the spreadsheets I send them. It's the perfect job for me. Minimal interaction, maximum solitude. The work can be tedious, but it pays the bills. And I get lost in numbers, patterns, and figures. Like solving puzzles, and I've always loved puzzles. Sometimes, if I'm feeling what constitutes wild for me, I play music while I work, smoke a little weed. I eat lunch, go for a run, shower, log back on again until I get however far I want to with my work projects, then cap off the day with dinner, a movie, a book, or both. It's the weekend. Every once in a while, I'll catch up with an old friend or one of my sisters, but only every few months or so. If I'm being totally honest, solitude is what feels safest to me. My mom died when I was still in high school, and after, my dad wasn't the greatest guy, to put it lightly. I spent my teens cleaning up his messes. Then, to make things more challenging, when I moved out, my college roommate was the same. After all that bullshit, I stick to a routine, keep things simple. No one coming home at 3 a.m. drunk off their ass, no pillow over the head to drown out the screams of adults that should know better. I was at the tail end of my usual quiet night in when I saw the dog, sitting in my favorite armchair, half asleep, trying to keep my eyes open long enough to get to the end of a chapter of I Am Legend. At first, I thought I imagined it, like my brain was so far turned off to reality that I had started conjuring up characters from the story, which, if you don't know, incidentally, does feature a dog. But as I stared out my window, growing increasingly more awake, I knew the dog was real. It was a scruffy-looking thing, covered in mud, right in the middle of the yard. I could tell it was staring back at me through the window. It sniffed the air and sat down, wagging its tail in a way that was so pathetically hopeful, had me sliding on my slippers and down the stairs before I even knew what I was doing. The truly odd thing about the dog being there, that it shouldn't have been able to get in. Fencing I have is a solid 8-foot wall, overlapping wooden slats. I'm in Colorado in an area with a lot of farms, and I had one of the companies that usually handles places like ranches come out to do it. It's completely gap-free and dug deep into the ground to stop anything from burrowing underneath. The whole thing's built like a fortress, according to my neighbors. It was this whole thing with the HOA. So I was intrigued, to say the least. Like I said, puzzles always have a way of hooking me in ever since I was a kid. My sisters have this inside joke that I'm like one of those folklore vampires, that you can stop me in my tracks if you throw me a tangle of knots. I made my way to the kitchen, lit by moonlight and silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Flicked on the porch lamp, illuminating the deck and the path that led to the unexpected visitor in my yard. I blinked out into the darkness, taking stock of the situation. The dog was big, really big. Much larger than the usual mid-sized kind you see in suburban neighborhoods like mine. Its fur was grayish, shaggy, and matted, and it had obviously seen better days, like a stuffed animal that had been left out in the rain. Maybe a working dog that wandered off a farm, thought. Something around the dog's neck caught the light. At first, it just seemed like a part of the shagginess, maybe a knotted clump of hair. It was a dark, bulky protrusion that stood out against its matted fur. But as the dog shifted, laying down more squarely under the beam of light, the object glinted. It was secured by what looked like weathered straps, wrapping around the dog's thick neck. Curiosity piqued. I leaned in closer to the window, but it was hard to make out the details from that distance. The thought that it could be something like a collar for an invisible fence crossed my mind. But it looked too cumbersome for that. Definitely something more substantial and odd for a working dog. A puzzle strapped to another puzzle. I forgot to grab a sweatshirt, so I braced myself for the chill of the night air, unlocked the back door, and stepped out onto the deck. Porch light didn't quite reach the far corners of the yard, leaving the edges dipped in shadow. The yellow glow clashed with the blue moonlight, making everything, clean-cut hedges, the angles of distant fences, look oddly disproportionate. Out of space and time, like the cookie-cutter model homes on either side of my own repeated infinitely. As I edged closer, the gravel of the pathway crunched underfoot, a sharp contrast to the stillness of the night. The dog, noticing my approach, perked up. Its tail gave a cautious wag, and its eyes watched me intently, but it didn't make any move to come closer or run away. It just sat there, looking somewhat forlorn, but oddly expectant in that way dogs always seem to do. I stopped a few feet away, giving it space, trying not to spook it. Up close, I could see the object around its neck clearly. It was a camera, and a large one at that, secured with an elaborate harness that seemed out of place against its scruffy fur. Intrigued, I crouched down to the dog's level, carefully reaching out a hand. Dog sniffed the air, its nose twitching. There was a soft, warm intelligence in its brown eyes, buried under hairy eyebrows clashing with its rough exterior. It stood up and took a few steps closer. "Hey there," I said softly. Without warning, the dog's lips pulled back into a snarl, spitting out a low, rumbling growl. I instinctively recoiled, heart hammering in my chest, kicking myself for not just calling animal control. I had completely forgotten my phone altogether. It was charging upstairs, and now I was in a dominant standoff with a massive dog with, I soon realized, bigger balls than mine. Ugh. It was so tense, I barely breathed. But after a few agonizingly long minutes, I realized he wasn't looking at me. The dog's rigid body, pinned ears, and narrowed eyes were angled, fixed intently on something I couldn't see at the far end of the yard. Yet another thing I hadn't thought of. What if something else was out here with him? I squinted into the darkness, trying to discern what he might be seeing. There was nothing. As I stood there, waiting for my pulse to settle, I watched the dog closely, readying myself to bolt for the back door if I needed to. I spoke to him in a low, soothing tone in an attempt to calm his nerves, and mine. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. There's nothing there. D?" I gestured towards the empty corner as if he could understand. The tension gradually left his body. His ears relaxed, and his tail began to wag, albeit hesitant. After one last lingering glance at the corner of the fence, which unnervingly seemed to loom larger despite all reason, I knew it was time to bring the dog inside. I walked back to the door and held it open. The dog seemed to consider his options, then slowly made his way up the steps with a resigned, tired air and passed through the doorway. I shut the door behind us, cutting off the chill of the night. Inside, the dog paused, taking in his new surroundings. I led him to the fridge, where I had some cold cuts for sandwiches. Even with as little as I knew about pet care, I figured chicken would do in a pinch. I opened the package and poured the contents into a bowl, setting it on the floor. The dog approached it hesitantly, sniffed, and then began to eat with a sort of polite desperation. While the dog ate, I took a closer look at the camera strapped around his neck. The harness was complicated, with adjustable straps to keep it secure. Fit snugly around the dog's broad neck. I reached down and unbuckled it as gently as I could. The dog paused his eating to look up at me, eyes holding a flicker of anxiety. "It's okay, buddy," I reassured him, hoping I sounded authentic instead of how I felt. It was awkward. I couldn't remember when I last talked to a dog. I hesitated for a second, then scratched behind his ears. Seeming reassured, he went back to eating. When I pulled my hand away, it came back covered with a crust, and I winced, not wanting to think too hard about what it had been rolling around in. The harness and camera came free with a little more effort. A scattering of pebbles caught under the straps scattered over the tile floor. With the burden removed, the dog seemed visibly relieved, body relaxing, tail swaying. I set the harness on the table and walked to the sink. As I went to grab the dish soap, I noticed the color of the tacky gunk that coated my palm, a deep, rusted red. Dried blood? My heart leapt to my throat. I scrubbed my hands quickly, watching red-brown flakes swirl down the drain, wondering what on earth I had gotten myself into. I braced myself against the sink and considered my options, which were pretty few, considering how late it was, then grabbed a pair of rubber gloves from under the sink. Darting from his neck, where the harness had been, I checked his fur and skin, parting the matted fur as I looked for any signs of wound. Thankfully, he remained calm, tail thumping lightly on the floor a few times, like he enjoyed the attention. Didn't find a single cut. Maybe he had rolled around in a dead animal. Even in my limited experience with pets, I knew they liked to do things that big reason we weren't allowed to have a dog growing up. I went to the closet and grabbed an old t-shirt that had been destined for the rag pile. I lathered it up with more soap and worked the cloth through his thick, matted fur, pulling away layers of that murky red mud, or at least I told myself it was just mud. I toweled him dry and set him up comfortably on an old bath mat. Underneath all the muck, he had wiry gray curls and hair on his muzzle that curled into a little mustache. He sprawled out, looking quite content. Then I turned my attention to the camera that had been strapped around his neck. It seemed like it belonged on a wildlife expedition, not a suburban stray. I had enough familiarity with similar equipment to know it had all the marks of something expensive being repurposed, including labels scratched off for anonymity. The person that rigged it knew what they were doing, enough to make sure that whoever it belonged to originally wouldn't be able to prove it was theirs. I grabbed my spare laptop from my office and sat back down at the kitchen table, trying not to look too closely at the clock ticking down in the corner of the screen. I felt wide awake, anyway. I knew it wasn't going to be a simple plug-and-play situation. The camera was a heavy-duty piece with a connector that didn't match the usual USB cables I had lying around. Digging through my junk drawer hoard, I found an old universal adapter kit that seemed promising. I shuffled through the adapters until I found one that looked like it could fit the port. Success. Connecting it felt like a small victory, although I didn't have anyone to share it with. I looked down at the dog, and he thumped his tail once, like a little sarcastic "congrats." I attached the other end to my laptop with a hopeful kind of skepticism, half expecting it not to recognize the device. To my relief, after a moment of nothing happening, just when I thought it wouldn't work, popped up, listed ambiguously as external device. Opening the camera's storage, I found a single file, a surprisingly regular .avi. As it loaded, I glanced down again at my new companion, sprawled comfortably by the table legs, watching me with a mix of curiosity and tired calm. "You're welcome," I said. He blinked at me and thumped his tail again. As an afterthought, while I was waiting for the video to load, I got up and filled a bowl of water, which he slurped with enthusiasm. He made a complete mess of it, but I had to admit he looked cute while he did it. Even though I knew the video was loading, it still made me jump when the audio came on. "All right, Augie, you look great. Ready to be famous?" A woman's face came into frame. Pretty, maybe in her mid-40s, with a smattering of freckles on her chin and forehead. The angle was close enough that you could see the laugh lines crinkling in the corner of her eyes as she smiled down at the dog. "Augie?" I asked aloud as I eased myself back in the chair, checking to see the dog's reaction. His ears perked up, and his tail batted against the ground, fastest I had seen it move yet. The name suited him. In the video, Augie barked a few times until the woman laughed and rose out of frame. The camera jostled as Augie bolted forward, the edges of the frame blurring with the rapid movement. Clay-colored boulders loomed large and vibrant on either side, their jagged silhouettes painted against a cloudless, bright blue sky. The ground beneath Augie's racing paws was a mix of sand and stone that wound through the landscape, broken only by the occasional tuft of scrub grass. The frame tilted abruptly. The view skewed, and there was the sound of something skittering, claws on stone. The camera now suddenly showed only a sliver of the bright sky and the rough, shadowed edges of rock on either side. Augie struggled, his whines echoing off the rock walls. In his excitement, he had misstepped and wound up tumbling into a narrow crack in the earth. The footage was chaotic, capturing every frantic movement as he struggled, the camera bumping and shaking erratically with his efforts to free himself. My stomach twisted with anxiety for him, even though I knew Augie was right next to me without a scratch. I leaned down to pat his head, and he rolled his eyes up to give me an appreciative look. "Tough day, eh, big guy?" He snorted and sighed, as if agreeing, then closed his eyes again. In the video, somewhere in the distance, I could hear the woman yelling. She must have seen him fall. "Augie, stay calm, boy. Stay calm," he instructed. But despite her words, her tone was frantic. A few minutes later, the camera captured her leaning over the gap, panting as heavily as Augie, her face and tank top drenched in sweat as she reached down towards the trapped dog. "Easy, Augie. Easy," she soothed, assessing the situation from above. Her fingers stretched towards him, but she couldn't reach far enough to grab hold of his harness. With a frustrated grunt, she pulled back, disappearing from the frame. Faintly, I could just make out her saying, "Damn, of all the fucking times, no service." Then silence. All that was left was the unsettling sound of Augie's distressed panting and the slight scraping of his paws against the rock as he continued to try to escape. Moments later, the woman's voice sounded again, this time brisk with purpose. "All right, honey, I found another way down. You right there?" She said off camera before she stepped into view again, sweat plastering her hair to her cheeks, pointing towards the left side of the screen, as if he could understand her. And to his credit, the camera swiveled slightly as he perked up at her return, and he followed the gesture. The woman's descent into the cave was off camera, but after a few tense minutes, Augie was finally freed, his harness ripping just enough to pull it away from the rock walls. He scrambled up beside her, and she checked him over for any injuries, her fingers running through his fur. She hugged him, relief washing over her face, visible even through the grainy footage. "Good boy, Augie," she repeated over and over again, her voice thick with relief. The woman took a moment to wipe her face with the bottom of her tank top, scrubbing away the worst of the tears and dirt. Then she stood up and surveyed their surroundings. Her gaze lingered on something to the side, pathway she had taken to reach Augie. The camera on the collar captured her eyes tracing back along the dark, narrow tunnel. "Shit," she said quietly. Her expression turned contemplative, then concerned. The footage showed her walking a few steps back towards the tunnel entrance. Peering into its craggy brown shadows, rock was visibly unstable, debris wedged in the place she must have initially come through. For the next hour, she pulled at the fallen rocks, but they didn't budge, only sending a few smaller stones clattering down and raising clouds of dust. She tried the thin rift that Augie had fallen through, but couldn't get the right vantage, slipping down the sides over and over again. Throughout the process, she screamed for help until her voice was hoarse. Apparently realizing the futility of her efforts, she stepped back, kneeling down to Augie. Her face centered in frame as she wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. The thin sunlight steaming through the cracks at the surface illuminated her face, accentuating her worried expression. "All right, Aug. No way out but forward, it looks like. Remember I said today was going to be an adventure?" she said, reaching a hand to pet his muzzle. She sighed. "I'm sorry, buddy. I should have paid attention to the signs. This is my fault. But I got us into this mess. I'll get us out." Her voice was determined. She gave his head a pat, jostling the camera. Then she took out a bottle of water from a fanny pack, taking a sip before offering some to Augie. I wondered what kind of signs she meant. Signs as in, she should have recognized how unstable the land was? Or literal ones, as in, no trespassing. She pulled her phone from her fanny pack, tapping the flashlight on to augment the waning daylight that filtered weakly through the cracks above. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the uneven, rocky terrain of the tunnel system they were now committed to navigating. The footage became increasingly more unsettling as they delved deeper into the cave system. The initial narrow, constricting tunnel opened up into a series of interconnected chambers that, while undeniably larger, had a vastness that was paradoxically claustrophobic. The light from the small flashlight seemed insignificant in the expansive spaces. The beam swallowed completely by the darkness. The walls were uneven, pockmarked with deeper pockets and crevices that were disorienting in how similar each footstep was to the last. Stalactites and stalagmites merged into pillars, petrified organic growths that looked almost alien. Paths narrowed into chokingly tight squeezes. The worst of the footage showed them approaching a particularly slim passageway, the walls seeming to press in from all sides. The woman had to turn sideways to fit, her back scraping against the rock, tearing her shirt and cutting into the flesh below. The sound was harsh, grating, unnervingly loud. Augie hesitated behind her, the camera bobbing as he seemed reluctant to follow, but with gentle coaxing and a soft tug on his harness, he obeyed. The woman seemed increasingly unnerved as well. Her breathing became heavier, and her fruitless attempts to find service on her phone more frequent. Each breath seemed to bounce off the walls, creating a looping kind of anxiety. The woman paused, shining her light in a slow arc, the beam catching on distant, glistening wet rocks. "Augie, where are we?" she whispered, and it seemed scream loud after the oppressive silence. "My head is killing me. The pressure down here." She trailed off. Augie sighed, deeming to echo her sentiment. They pressed on for hours. Only once they stopped and rested, eating a sparse meal of an energy bar and a plastic baggie full of dog treats. It was grueling and heartbreaking to watch. The whole point of it was to try to find out where on earth the dog had come from. And now, what happened to the woman who owned him? But I still felt a pang of guilt when I clicked fast forward. It felt like I was abandoning them, like I should get changed and do something, even though it obviously wasn't happening in real time. I settled for petting Augie again, who was so tired that he barely even twitched. Then, abruptly, the atmosphere in the footage shifted. There was, quite literally, a light at the end of the tunnel, bright, like it was high noon sunlight. A tense breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding escaped my chest as the camera moved forward, Augie's head angled down towards his uncertain steps. "Oh, Jesus, thank God, thank God," the woman said. She crouched down to put her arms around Augie's neck, covering the lens in the dark curls of her hair. Tears were visible on her cheeks, smudged with that red-brown mud. The hole was positioned awkwardly at the base of the tunnel's end, an irregular break in the cave wall, its edges rough and jagged. The woman approached cautiously, her figure silhouetted against the stark light, measuring the size with her hands before positioning herself to crawl through. She whistled for Augie, who seemed strangely hesitant to follow her, lingering in the darkness of the cave for a long moment before finally following her. The light intensified, turning the screen stark and white, filling the tunnel's exit with a blinding glow that seemed almost otherworldly. As the camera's exposure adjusted, the outlines of a large interior space began to crystallize on the screen. It was a room. Augie's camera, jostling slightly with each step he took, revealed smooth concrete walls and high ceilings supported by thick concrete beams. Stark, utilitarian, man-made space that seemed like a different planet after so much time spent in the jagged confines of the cave system. There were shelves along the wall, sealed water bottles, stacks of blankets, and white boxes with red crosses that must have been medical supplies. Despite all the evidence, the realization still dawned on me slowly. The woman and her dog had stumbled into some kind of bunker. As Augie padded around the room, following the woman as she carefully explored the space, seemingly as confused as I was, the camera angled back to the wall they had come through. The stalagmites were visible through the torn rock. It looked as if something had burrowed into the side of it, or burrowed out. There was something next to the hole, a pile of wires, and maybe some other electronics. But Augie didn't linger long enough to get anything more than a blurry glimpse, even when I paused the video. Seconds later, there was a hollow clicking noise. The woman turned to face it. Augie followed her line of vision and stared into the barrel of a shotgun. My stomach lurched, and the woman cried out, raising her arms. Augie, who must have sensed danger even if he didn't know what it was, took a few cautious steps back, growling, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. We've been wandering for hours, over a full day now, and we're not trying to do anything," stammered. The shotgun belonged to another woman, tall, painfully thin, with long, stringy blonde hair. She was dressed in a sweatsuit that had seen better days, and her hands trembled where they held the gun, which she moved from side to side as if she wasn't certain to focus on the dog or the woman. "Mom?" A voice called out. There was a shuffling noise off-screen. Stay, Kyle. Stay with Corey and your father." "Please," Augie's owner begged. "I promise, we're not trying to." "Mom, is everything okay?" "Kyle, I told you to stay." A small blonde head peered out from the side of the doorway. A little boy as painfully thin as his mother. "Please, I just need you to call 911. Or I might have service now if you just let me." The mother and son turned to look back at Augie's owner, their faces shocked. They stayed in silence for a while. Augie turned his head back and forth to watch the standoff. "Come on," woman said, gesturing with the barrel of the gun. "If that dog comes for me, you're both done. He'll be good. Augie's a good dog. And I'm—" The woman said, "No names." The blonde woman cut her off, her voice flat. I let out a hissing breath, my hands clenching into fists, an ominous thing to say considering she had already called her son by name. She didn't want to humanize her. I wondered if the other woman realized, if she knew what a bad sign that was. Augie's claws scraped the concrete floor as he followed the women, paused and looked at the boy, who looked at him with an intensely curious expression, like Augie was some kind of exotic species. The camera jostled as Augie followed his owner, her filthy hands still reaching towards the ceiling, as they were forced deeper into the bunker. They moved through a narrow hallway lined with pipes and flickering fluorescent lights that eventually gave way to a more open area. At the far end, there was a couch arranged like a bed, where a man lay connected to an IV stand, his features gaunt and pallid. Beside him, a little boy, Corey I guessed, sat in a small chair, his unwashed blonde hair matching the woman's and the other boy's, his body equally thin and fragile looking. "Sit," the blonde woman commanded. Augie did what he was told immediately, facing his owner, who did the same in a banged-up folding chair, one of a few that had been placed in a semicircle around the couch. The other two did the same, sitting on either side of Corey. The blonde woman never lowered the gun. Augie moved his head slowly, taking in the space around him. It was a makeshift living room, set up in such a way that it seemed more like an infirmary, everything looking out of place against the stark concrete walls. The woman and her two sons faced Augie and his owner. This strange, palpably tense tableau held for a moment, everyone frozen in place, as if waiting for someone else to make the next move. "We used to have a dog," one of the boys, Kyle, said suddenly. He was still staring at Augie. "Quiet," the mother said. Then, after a beat, he spoke again. "When did you come from?" "It was just outside of the state park in—" "Not where," she interrupted. "When?" I'm not sure what you mean. Just answer the question." The woman's harsh tone made Augie turn his head to focus on her. "Well, it's 2024, Augie's owner answered slowly. The blonde woman's face twisted and went slack. She mouthed the numbers silently. "But," one of the boys started. There was a noise as he stood up from his chair, and Augie turned to look, camera focusing on the two boys. "Don't, Kyle. Dad said that would start happening," Corey said, looking down at the man on the couch. "I said don't," their mother said, but she sounded defeated. "But he did it, Mom." "We don't know that. She could be lying." "I'm not," Augie's owner interjected quickly. What year do you think it is?" "It's—" The boy started to answer. "Stop," their mother said, this time more forcefully. "Why?" Kyle asked, his voice a whine. "'Cause I said so." "But it's— both of you leave. Go. Right now. To the beds." "Why? What did we do?" "Just go, Kyle. Now." There was a shuffling noise as both of the boys seemed to obey. The woman moved to take the seat closest to the man on the couch. There was a long silence. The only sound in the camera, Augie's nervous breathing. "There's a war," the blonde woman said abruptly. "I'm sorry?" Augie's owner asked haltingly. The blonde woman didn't answer. "I'm just trying to understand, what kind of war? That's why you're here? Like you're worried about a bomb?" "A bomb?" The woman snorted, then barked out a laugh, then another, until it shifted into something indiscernible from a sob. "God, a bomb." She wiped at her face, at her running nose. "I wish." Another long beat of silence, then, "They tore it open," she said, almost too soft to hear. "Tore what open?" "Everything. Life itself." "Life itself?" What the fuck? I'm not trying to make trouble. If you show me where the exit is, or just let us go back to the caves. They're trying to fix it. The scientists that are left. My husband was one of them, but he came back to us. He says there's no solution, only a way out. Do you mean the cave? We can all go if you want. She took a deep breath. It's not an easy trip that I can show you. The blonde woman ignored her, bending down to kiss her husband's forehead. As she leaned, her hair moved, revealing her neck. It was like looking at the middle of an autopsy. The back of her spine, visible above the collar of her sweatshirt, was mottled with bruises. In the center, blackened skin looked as if it was being burned in real time. Blood and pus leaked out of the wound, staining the fabric. It looked like bone was peeking from the places where the skin had given out. We can't go, the blonde woman said quietly, still leaning over her husband's prone body. It seemed as if Augie's owner saw what I saw, at least enough of it to add a tremble of desperation to her voice. Okay, I understand. What about if we just go? Me and my dog? She shifted in her chair. Please? Were you one of the ones he was talking to? Did you know? The blonde woman asked quietly. What? No, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said he made contact. For it. She took a shuddering breath. It doesn't matter. They're destroying the whole thing. It's not worth it, they said. Not worth losing it all. Listen, I don't know what you're talking about. Please. She stopped, cut off by the sound of the shotgun's safety. Augie, sensing the tension, made a small growl of warning. What's the camera for then? Camera? The one on the dog. Big fucking one, right there. She gestured towards Augie. There was silence. I had forgotten about it. It's just something I bought online. For fun. Sure. The blonde woman scoffed. Suddenly there was a rustling. They both turned to the man on the couch. Mike? The blonde woman asked, laying a hand on his head. Baby? Another rustling noise. The blonde woman started to wail. Oh no. Oh Mike, no. The man shuddered as if having a seizure. Then a deep red stain bloomed on the top of the sheet. It rose, almost like the man was starting to sit up, but his head remained still, shaking as if being pulled by puppet strings. The sheet continued to rise, almost comically, like a classic Halloween ghost. The blonde woman shot up out of the chair, fell to the ground, clattering. She pointed the shotgun towards her husband, towards the rising white sheet. Mom? One of the boys distantly called. Stay back, she yelled. The sheet fell to the ground. For a split second, there was something there. Something long, twisted and bony, dripping with viscera. It unfurled. Like the body of a man was a cocoon. Impossibly, its face unfolded from the air itself. It was large, featureless as a buffalo skull, slick and grayish, like it had been pulled from the ocean. Lower limbs strained awkwardly, as if it was something freshly born, clinging to the rubbery flesh it was still attached to. The blonde woman was sobbing hard, too hard. The shotgun slipped to the floor. She scrambled to the ground to try to retrieve it. The man's empty skin slipped to the ground as the last of the bony, rotating limbs ripped itself free. And the moment the last part of the creature left the man's body, disappeared, was never there. I rewound the footage and paused it, just to make sure I didn't miss something in the shaky footage. Augie was moving his head back and forth between the chaos. Nothing changed. 1 second, the creature was there, and the next, nothing. At this point, the blonde woman seemed to truly panic. She moved wildly in a circle, the gun arcing in a shivering orbit. The lights overhead flickered. Augie's owner took advantage of the other woman's distraction. She bolted out of the chair, grabbed his harness, and pulled him towards the door. Augie was growling, the sound so deep that the camera shook. He dug down, resisting being pulled for as long as he could. Then they raced to the doorway. The two boys, who must have been drawn by the noise, stood together there, eyes wide with terror. The woman and Augie ran past them, down the hallway, back towards the storeroom they came in. In the flickering lights, the crack in the wall seemed thinner than when they first came through. The woman ran to it. Augie lingered in the doorway, looking down the dark hallway, growling. The lights went out, leaving them in total darkness. Come on, Augie, the woman whispered. The dog stared down the black hallway. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, blood-curdling shrieks. The camera jerked back. The woman pulled Augie's harness, forcing him from the hallway. In a crush of moving limbs, she pulled him through the crack in the wall. For a few agonizingly long minutes, the footage was completely washed out, punctuated only by heavy breathing. Then a close-up of the woman's tense face, bloodshot red eyes. She turned the flashlight on, held near her chin. She was shaking. "I'm sorry, Augie," the woman said, reaching out a hand to pet the dog. The sentence was laden with a tangle of emotion. There was a skittering noise, a distant rock falling. Augie turned to look at it. Then there was a scream, the sound of something hitting the ground hard. When the camera focused on her again, the woman was on her stomach, hands grasping the dirt. She still held her phone, and the light skittered on the cave walls. She dug her fingers in so hard one of her nails came off, blood seeping out. But she was pulled, quickly, forceful. Again and again. The crack in the wall was, against all reason, getting smaller, contracting impossibly fast. Something pulled at her legs one last time, and she was out of the cave until only her bloody nails visible, barely clinging to the sides of the hole. And then those were gone too. Augie stared at the now closed wall like he couldn't understand what had happened. He whined and pawed at the slim line where the hole was. The wall shook hard. The dog jumped back, watching small rocks shudder on the ground. It shook again, like something was beating against it. Augie turned and started running, frantically navigating back out into the cave system. He wound his way through the darkness in a blind run, through passages that seemed smaller, seemed to be contracting, just like the hole. After what felt like an eternity but was only about an hour, the cave system seemed inexplicably shorter than before. Guided by what must have been scent, Augie discovered a barely visible break in the wall. Once again he emerged, not into the open canyon where he had started. It was a dark, cluttered space. It took me a moment to recognize what it was, as his head frantically searched the room. My breath caught in my throat. It was a basement. It was my basement. Augie climbed onto a pile of boxes, then leaped towards the small window at the top of the wall. He squeezed through the rusted latch and through the narrow opening, his body contorting with effort as he pushed himself out into the night. He sat, panting, in the middle of the yard. Just a few minutes later, last footage was me, standing in my pajamas in the back doorway. I don't know how long I sat at the table, staring at the dark screen, trying to process. But I know as soon as I came to, I ran, socks sliding against the tile, whipping open the door to the basement, flicking on the light switch, bounding down the steps 2 at a time. Augie must have woken up, as I could hear his claws clicking behind me. I flew past towers of cardboard boxes, past all the other crap I meant to throw away years ago, and then looked at the far corner. There was a crack in the wall, one that hadn't been there before. A small one, not big enough for a dog to fit through, especially not one as big as Augie, but there was a spray of churned, rust-colored earth around it. I thought of the footage from the camera, the woman's hands disappearing behind the crack. Behind me, Augie started to growl. So, yeah, we got the fuck out there. And I still have a chair against the door, just in case. Not that I'm even sure that would help. I haven't decided what to do with the video yet. I need more time to think through it. I started searching local news sites and social media for any mentions of a missing woman with a dog. Then, I broadened my search when I realized I couldn't be certain it even happened in Colorado. And then I thought, could have been a movie. Some student film, made before I bought the house. When I moved in, there was shit in the basement. Maybe it was a prank, and someone had lowered him over the fence. Then I had another thought that was even stranger. And bear with me, because I know how insane it sounds. I couldn't really even be sure that it was our reality to begin with. Whatever was going on down in those caves, if it was real, who's to say they didn't go missing from another reality altogether? On one hand, it seemed pretty fucking real. The continuous footage, the way Augie looked when he came here, crack in my basement wall. On the other hand, well, I think that's obvious. The implications defy the laws of reality. Regardless of what's real, I love Augie. He's an awesome dog. He fit right into my life. He keeps me company through the day, goes on runs with me, has a ton of personality. I'm not really in the market to post flyers for... I don't even know who would be looking for him. Film student from the local college, a government agency, whoever might know more about whatever the whole thing was. He has episodes. That's what I've started thinking of them as. Anyway, the times when he stares at a place where the shadows are thick, in the corner of a room, in a dark spot between the trees when we're on a walk, and the hair raises on his back, and he starts growling, warding off bad memories. Maybe. But it makes me think of all the other times people swear their animals see something they can't. I think about the creature that seemed to just disappear, the mother's gaunt, listless face. They tore it open. I always make sure to give Augie extra head scratches, a few more treats, to make him feel better. Or maybe to let him know, keep up the good work. All in all, I do know one thing for certain. As one nightmare fades, another emerges from the darkness. Prepare yourself for the next tale of terror. The sinister people behind the door. Let me get this straight from the start. No, I do not believe that my family's house was haunted back then. However, one thing is for sure. No matter what the reason was, something sinister had targeted me during the summer of 2006. It all began during one of those nights, when my 9-year-old self preferred playing with a game handheld with low volume instead of sleeping. At some point around 2 in the morning, my ordeal started out of the blue. I heard the door slowly open and quickly hid the console under my pillow, which literally muted the device as I faked being asleep. With care, I then opened one eye just enough, expecting to see my mother, the single parent of the house, checking on me to ensure I was asleep. But instead, the door just remained partially open. I waited for at least 4 minutes, which felt like forever, thinking she already saw what she needed to, while my eyes were closed, and hoping to see her close the door. When I was fed up with waiting, I decided to get out of bed and close the door silently. However, the moment I approached, the door was violently slammed shut.
Later in the morning, by mere fear of snitching on myself, I avoided mentioning any of it to my mother, expecting she would then assume that I was awake the whole time. I went about my day, doing what kids do, and during the night, I was back to business with the game handheld. Once again, around 2 in the morning, the door slowly opened. Well, Josh, you know the routine, I thought, confident and executing the usual choreography to deceive my mother. Once again, I opened one eye and the door was partially open with no other particular activity. Annoyed because I did not want to walk to the door like the night before, I called Mommy, faking a sleepy and tired voice to the best of my ability, but got no response the first time. Mom? I insisted more convincingly after a few seconds. The non-verbal response I obtained covered me with shivers. 4 fingers, white like snow, appeared as an unknown hand gripped the top of the door, the way a person would do to hold it open. They were almost glowing in the dark, almost fluorescent. Was it a glove? No, because I could glimpse the dark color of the nails contrasting with the fingers. They remained there, no movement, nobody taking a look or fully coming in the room. Mom, is that you? I asked, hesitantly. How could it be her? I knew for a fact that my mom had a personal reason for never painting her nails, so they were never that dark. I called again, worried at this point, and in response, a second set of 4 similar fingers appeared at the very bottom of the door, as the intruder unnaturally gripped the door with his other hand. Assumed. I began hyperventilating, mustering the strength to scream for my mother at this point. But when I tried, only a whimper came out of my mouth instead. In response, a third set of 4 similar fingers appeared in the middle of the door near the handle. Mommy? I heard multiple people say at the same time. At least, this is how I can describe what I heard. It was as if they miserably tried to imitate me, frightening me instead. I just screamed. The 3 hands quickly retreated behind the door, which was then violently slammed shut by the intruders. A few seconds later, my mother stormed inside the room. She just reassured me that it was nothing and opted for me to sleep beside her in the main bedroom. Nothing else happened that night, and having my mother with me meant no more furtive nocturnal gaming, but at least 100% safety. How wrong I was. About 2 days later, I was peacefully sleeping one night, with my back glued to my mother's chest and belly, when I was suddenly awakened by a strange noise. I opened my eyes and immediately looked at the door from where I was, without moving an inch, and witnessed a vision of horror. The fingers were there, the hands were back. That time, there were around 10 hands, and thus countless fingers tapping on the door with the tips of their nails, the way some people casually do on a table when they wait for something. "Moon," I whispered, trying to notify her without alerting the intruders. "Moon, wake up," I insisted, discreetly tapping her thigh with my hand. Her response froze my whole being. "Shh, just ignore it, Josh. Sleep," she said, or placing her arm over my body to reassure me. Instead, what I saw mortified me to the point that I could no longer make any sound. Arm that covered me was as white as snow, with dark nails at the end of each of its fingers. Paralyzed with terror, I remained still, trembling to the core and letting tears of fear just streaming from my eyes. I remained there the whole night, and to this day I do not know how I fell asleep, but I did. The next morning, I woke up to my mom getting ready for work, as if nothing strange happened. Was it really my mom? Was my own mother part of the intruders? I guess we will never know. We did not talk about it at the time and never did since. I requested to go back to my room the same day, opted for barricading my door every night. To this day, I still do so, no matter what building or room I spend the night into, and nobody understands why. I know that I have to. Why? Because every night I can still hear the faint tapping of multiple fingers on the door. Sometimes they even knock, but never say anything other than that distorted mommy. For whatever reason, I just know that I should never come face to face with the sinister people behind the door. Before you catch your breath, let's delve into another story that will make your heart race and your skin crawl. 8 corpses were discovered around town. All of them had their eyes gouged out. It all started happening so fast. One body found after another. Our small station was scrambling to attend to each case, collecting evidence, finding connecting threads, and controlling the media circus while speaking with victims' families. Our town felt like it was set on fire overnight. Some bodies recovered, wrapped up a few missing persons cases we had ongoing, but none were missing for more than a month. It was hell. And naturally, the whole town started getting scared. There was never much of a criminal history here. Just a sleepy little town with primarily older folk. You know, mom and pop shops, somehow a Dollar General and the church, real paltry affair. While trying to control the tide of panic, we worked quickly to try to get ahead on a killing spree we were already behind on. First connecting thread, though, was clear as day. Out of the 7 bodies found, all of them had their eyes ripped from their sockets, as if someone had gone shopping for grapes. The caking crimson around their eyes faded quickly to darkness. Each body we discovered would stare back at us, pulling us a little deeper into that void. I had to see each of them. Whenever they connected a body to the case, it called me in to confirm. Another commonality was the Bibles. Now, our town is mighty religious. I'll admit that Sunday church is quite a communal event. But not everyone in town shares such beliefs. And that's fine, so long as you're not hurting anybody, believe or don't. In any case, each body would have a Bible lying nearby, though their families would swear they weren't the type to own one. It would seem old and quite used. Once white and pristine pages would be browned and aged like they were dug up from the soil. On the front of every Bible, written in fine handwriting, were the words, "Closer to God." Most victims seemed to struggle, but nothing substantial enough for us to get any reliable DNA samples from. Upon performing autopsies, we discovered that all the victims had rohypnol in their bodies. This implies that someone drugged all the victims to make them more manageable, and some victims caught on faster than others. So some victims would try to fight back, but ultimately fail in their impaired state. They attributed every victim's cause of death to a deep and ghastly wound on their right side. It is thought that the assailant would press a knife into their side and just keep forcing their way in. Interior lacerations suggest that he would sometimes get his whole fist inside and just wriggle the knife around. Suspected, that was how he guaranteed the victim would die. Between the puncture and the drugs, the victim was powerless to fight back as he took their eyes. It received descriptions of being messy and barbaric. They observed small scratches on the interior of the eye sockets. These minor scratches were more consistent with the markings of fingernails as opposed to a knife, meaning this pervert jammed his fingers into their eyes and plucked the things out. And it wasn't clean. He struggled quite a bit, scratching the insides over and over. Sometimes the eye sockets started forming cracks. Obviously, you don't want any killers roaming around, but this one needed to be found and caught right away. Everything suggested a manic and uncontrollable state. We didn't have leads. Despite the methods of killing and their personal beliefs, the victims had very little in common. My first thought was likely yours. I'm not saying this was the hardest case to crack, so I'm not trying to brag. If the whole thing hadn't thrown our station into chaos, it could have been any of us that made the connection. When I sat down in the church, the Sunday after the first body was found, I could feel it. Everyone was uneasy, and my body looked around the pews as if I had never clocked out. Eyeing everyone, sizing them up. Everyone was keeping it together, putting a face on. In the span of 2 weeks, investigators found all 7 bodies. The Sunday following the last body's discovery, being in that church made my skin crawl. A once haven started feeling like a birdcage. My skin was wriggling and my chest was tight. You never really know someone, and in that church, despite spending my whole life with them, all I saw was strangers. But I was looking in the wrong place. Well, that's not true. It was the right place, but the wrong perspective. While other officers led the investigation in different directions, I watched the church crowd, seeing if anyone seemed out of place. The words "out of place" stuck in my head. The letters tugged at my mind with strings, trying to get me to see something I wasn't seeing. Then it hit me. Out of place? Seeing something that I wasn't seeing? I got so caught up in trying to scan the churchgoers who were there that I had completely forgotten to consider the ones who weren't. Being the only church in town you get a handle on, the regulars dang quick. And a few were missing from the lot. First one I went after was a younger guy named Aaron. He was in his early 20s, and a bit of a loner. The whole town would murmur about his constant struggles with alcohol, how he would drink his life away and go to church on Sunday, begging for God to magically turn things around for him. I thought maybe he was angry, maybe he thought God betrayed him. So, I took it out on people and, well, honestly, I didn't have a motive for the eye gouging, but it was still something. So, I made my way to Aaron's residence and knocked on the door. When my fist met with the wood, it just swung open. The air inside, it immediately hung heavy with the foul traces of death. Little reapers drifting through the dust. My body heaved as the sickly air entered my lungs. Backup was quickly called, and I cautiously searched the house. As red and blue lights cascaded into the house, I stepped into his bedroom. I poised my gun and flashlight, with the flashlight's beam resting on the bed. I discovered that Aaron was our 8th victim. I gagged again and my heart sank. I shouted that I found a body, and 2 officers swept the rest of the house. The scene was recent. I could tell by how glossy some of the blood around his wound was, trails of it still pouring out. Hot bile swished around in my stomach. I was a battery about to erupt.
His body sprawled out on a bed that I initially thought had red covers, but his blood thinned from alcohol and spilled out like a river. He drenched the bed, soaking it down until the scarlet soaked into the wooden frame. It felt strange, seeing the Bible there, the page sitting open to familiar phrases. Closer to God. Under the phrase, though, was a name. A last message, written sloppily in blood, was offered by Aaron, whose fingertips were coated in red. Edgar. You'd think a town full of old folks would have a lot of Ed Edgars walking around, but not ours. There was just one. Edgar Tarkins, an older gentleman who had been missing from church for a while. Before bodies started popping up, people would check on him. He'd say he was too tired to go to church, but that he would pray on his own. Eventually, people stopped asking as he became increasingly aggressive about the pestering. He would affirm that he was fine, but was too ill or tired to attend church. People would spot him limping around town still, though, so no one prodded too deep. It was starting to get late when Aaron was found. While I got a lot of pull in this town, there are still people who can boss me around, and one such person told me to go home and rest upon the discovery of Aaron. That I had already seen too much and been too close to the case. Eventually, I had to relent, despite my protest. I was told that other officers would go apprehend him and that I'd be called call when he thought I was ready. I was admittedly very exhausted. I had kept my eyes open for far too long. So, with the sun vanishing beyond the horizon, I sat at home. Tried my best not to imagine the cops rolling up to Edgar's doorstep. My feet would pull me from one room to the other, burning trails into the carpet. I was meant to be relaxing, but there was this tightness in my chest, like I was waiting for my parents to discover something bad I had done. I just couldn't shake it. So I reached into the fridge, and against better judgment, I grabbed a beer. My fingers laced around the cap, and with a twist, I pulled it free from the bottle. Raising the bottle to my lips, I felt the cool glasses resting, inviting me to take my first sip. My hand hung there for a moment, teasing my mouth with the essence of the drink. In the back of my head, a bothersome feeling nagged at me, subconscious screaming at me to notice. And I did, upon pulling the bottle away from my mouth. I looked at the beer's label, and I wondered, were these always twist-off caps? My fingers grazed around the mouth of the bottle, and sure enough, there were no ridges that would allow you to just twist the cap off. I'm not a weak guy, but I wouldn't be able to pop it off like that without a little force. Which meant,
Before I could even finish my thought, I heard something slapping against the kitchen floor. Rapid pattering of bare feet smacked the chilled tile. Turning towards the sound, I barely glimpsed him as he slammed into me. Since I was so surprised, we were both thrown back and tumbled to the ground. My head spun as it smacked against the floor. My limbs moved around, trying to get a hold of the man who had tackled me. Vision had gone to static after the hit, and while it was slowly coming back, I was fighting effectively blind. As we wrestled for control, I kept thinking that it couldn't be Edgar. I'm not a weak man, but the person assaulting me, I could feel them overpowering me. If I wasn't desperate, adrenaline pumping through my veins, I would have lost the fight. Heart furiously pumping the blood I needed to survive, I fought back as best as I could, trying to get my bearings. I'd grab his wrist and forearms, trying my best to get a solid grasp. Even in the struggle, I knew it was wrong. The way his skin felt. In some areas, his skin felt like aged leather, particularly around the strange bumps I kept encountering. Squishy and bulbous protrusions on his skin, giant warts ready to pop. "And if thy right eye offends thee," the man on top of me growled. His voice shot out through gritted teeth, like an animal trying to ward me away. My vision was becoming clearer. We were both illuminated by the still open refrigerator. The soft yellow light reflected off the red blotches all over his body. I'm not sure if my vision was still blurry, or if I just couldn't wrap my head around what I was looking at. It was a nightmare, whole thing. With my senses coming together, I could affirm that it was indeed Edgar attacking me. The old man and his frail frame made me look like a child. "Megger, pluck it out and cast it from thee." He dragged on his words like a cigarette, the malic fill his lungs. His arms pushed down, I realized he was fighting his way to my face. He was trying to get to my damn eyes. Fought and fought, shouted at him. Anything I could. Still, was strange. Where was the knife? He had gored out his other victims. Why hadn't he stabbed me when he jumped at me? I searched his waist to see if he had the weapon on him. That's when I caught a solid sight of him. My vision no longer altered, and my mind was in fight or flight. I saw what he had done to himself. It was almost enough to make me drop my arms like life had dripped from my body. "For it is profitable for thee." His voice got louder, almost rattling my brain. Words growling like a bear. Drifting my gaze up along his naked torso, everything came into focus in the most horrid of fashions. Ick and festering patches of skin covered his body. His aged flesh had turned purple and putrid, with a yellow foam dripping down mixing with dark reds. These wounds weren't the worst part, though. He had caused large cuts on himself, which led to the decaying patches of skin in those areas. And in those cuts. Christ! When I looked at the cuts, I could see them staring back at me. The flesh had ridges and was pried open enough for me to see the eyeballs he had shoved into the wounds, looking back at me. I could feel my body convulsing as I tried to gather my strength. All 19 eyes had a home, freshest of which was Aaron's. Blood caked the flesh surrounding the eyeballs, giving the appearance that they were all crying, "That one of thy members should perish." His hot saliva smattered onto my face as I could feel his fingertips teasing the edges of my eye socket. Fighting him like that would not work. He'd overpower me. I don't know how. Hell, looking at his body, it was a miracle he was moving at all. But I had to take a risk. Slipping my left hand away, I continued to struggle with the right, with all the strength I could muster. My free hand frantically searched the floor around me. I couldn't quite reach the contents of the fridge, but I knew at least one thing should be near me still. Got harder to fight back as I felt his digits start to plunge. They pried my eyelids apart, and I could feel the sticky and grating texture of his fingers. I could feel down to the intricate detail where all his fingernails had chipped, leaving them jagged and cruel. My free arm reached back. I was losing the battle quickly. Each millimeter I lost made the sensation around my eye grow. And not that thy whole body. He pressed his fingers in, causing my vision to blur and my face to feel like a hot poker was being pressed into it. I must have been howling like a beast. I could feel my teeth gnashing together and my body writhing around. The pain became everything. All other senses dulled. I couldn't taste the filth that had dripped into my mouth. I couldn't hear our bodies fighting. Just searing agony, a high-pitch, wire-pulled taut pain. I was begging, not out loud anymore. I wanted anything to save me. Feeling of, this is really how it ends, washed over me. Thoughts going vacant. Those jagged fingernails dug around, pushing my eye around in its socket. Like a cat at the bathroom door, I heard his fingernails scratching against the bone. And one vicious and earth-splintering yank, my right field of vision turned off. He sat up, straddled me like a show pony, and observed the state of his prize. I was looking at my own desecrated eye. His hand twisted around so he could look at it from every angle. My body was growing weak, but I could see them. They were very faint, the hint of blue and red flashing on my walls. Should be cast into hell. He finished, his voice calmer, and spoke in an almost mocking tone, like he knew something I didn't. He grinned, the skin around his actual eyes wrinkled up. He looked like a demon. An unfathomable creation, an abomination. He must have noticed the lights too, increasing in intensity. Quickly bent over and lunged for my remaining eye. His hand got so close, but before those fingertips made contact, using what remaining strength I had, and beamed the side of his head with the beer bottle. An empty thunk rang out as his body crumbled to the side for a moment. I thought he was about to fall over, but then he stopped himself and laughed. The lights at this point were wrapping around us. The blood on his body momentarily vanished when red flooded the room, only to return in the blue light. With that, he backed off and stood. Between the hit to my head, the gouging of my eye, and the effort spent trying to stop it, I had nothing left in the tank. It was taking so much to not fall asleep. Instead, I stared at the madman standing above me, looking down at me with admiration. A softness in his eyes that was shared with the eyes that he had pressed into himself. They all looked down at me. He made me feel like a child in strength and mind. He held his trophy up and gazed into the eye he had taken from me. What good is an angel with no witness? He says aloud, a question that only sought an answer from himself. I was still getting used to the loss of vision, but when he retreated, it looked like he was so swift. His body almost became as he ran through the glass sliding door leading to the backyard. There was some brief shouting from the officers outside. Few of them got a shot off. Then they rushed through the door and spotted me. They lifted my body and carried me to the squad car. The hospital was close. By turning their lights on, they would get there faster than waiting for an ambulance. I told them everything I could at the moment, and then further details when I had pulled myself together. They looked at me like I had lost my mind. They believed me eventually. There were a few reported sightings from my neighbors that night to confirm what I had seen. My recovery took place at another officer's house, a close friend. None of us thought it was wise. I returned home for a while, in case he wanted my other eye. While recovering, the department looked high and low for Edgar, but he must have gotten out of town. They informed me that his house was mostly empty. There were Bibles in every room, drawings of angels, all taking various forms. I can only guess his motives and what he has planned. Whenever I think about the attack, I can swear the eyes on his body kept their attention on me. The wounds were so festered and gross, I didn't think trying to agitate them would have helped me. I know now that it might have. Edgar's plans, what he's doing, it's working. One morning I woke up and I had restored vision in my right eye. I sat up in bed and stared at the wall, trying to comprehend how I could have two different scenes in front of me. One was the warmly lit bedroom, the sun drifting through the windows catching spare specks of dust. The other eye, though, was in some deep and dingy basement. It had all the color washed out of it. Pages covered the floor and mold clung to the walls like peel and stick tile. In the middle of the room was a mirror, one that my right eye got closer and closer to. By covering my left eye, I could focus on that environment better. It was like I could choose not to be in the bedroom. My right eye, though? I can't close it. It's always open, always watching, and as it got closer to the mirror, that's all I could do was watch. Watch as Edgar stepped in front of it. I could see where he had placed my eye, was in his side, the same spot he had stabbed the others to kill them. Edgar had been busy. Panic caused me to grip the surrounding bedsheets. Eyes also covered his legs and his skin was bumpy and ill all over. He was a collection of shades, greens, purples, reds, and yellow. His body was dying in 100 different ways, and yet he stood tall and in that dark room. He had a radiant glow, I mean a literal glow. The intensity of his brightness was sufficient to light up the room. Something nestled in my thoughts when I saw that glow. Despite all the sermons I had attended, all the times I've hunched over on my knees and prayed, all my volunteering, the handful of lives I've saved, my whole life devoted to the church and my love for the people in this town. Despite all of it, looking at him, I felt closer to God. But what's scarier than one terrifying story? How about another one that's even more chilling? I saw a suspicious car in an empty wooded area in Washington. I am now, metaphorically, living in hell. I am currently typing this while trying to get as far away as I can from Tenaway River in Washington state. I don't know where I am going or where I am. All I know is that I have cell reception. I don't want anyone to get involved. I just want you to listen. It all started about 4 days ago, driving east to go to our usual camping spot. Something we have done every year for as long as I can remember. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Everything was nearly exactly as it had been every year. I should probably specify exactly who I was going with. I was with my mom, dad, uncle, cousin, and of course myself. All 6 of us have gone many places before. We are kind of like a vacation group. We had driven to the town near where we were camping, picked up groceries and supplies, and set off up the mountain road. It was mostly uneventful. My cousin found a colorful bug or something which she got excited about, but other than that, it was again completely uneventful. We started up the mountain road, enjoying the scenery, or at least 5 of us were. My cousin was hunched over next to me in the back of our minivan staring at her phone. After about 30 minutes, we finally went out of cell reception. Right as our car drove over the section of road that transitioned from smooth concrete to rough gravel. At this point, we were extremely far up the long, winding mountain road. There is technically only one actual campground up the Tenaway Road, but there are plenty of pull-out spots and clearings that are way prettier and more private, and most importantly, free. We usually have one pull-out spot that we always go to, but there are other good ones as well. Pull-out spot in question is a spot all the way down at the bottom of the river, the long driveway leading down to it. This driveway is extremely difficult to navigate in a car. We pulled up to the top of this driveway and parked. 3 of us stayed in the car, and 3 of us walked down to check if anyone was camping in the spot. The people who walked down were me, my mom, and my uncle. Thinking all the way back, I cannot remember a singular time someone had actually been camping at that spot. However, this time there was somebody. A singular orange car was parked at the bottom of the driveway, with one man, seemingly in his 40s, 50s, sitting in the driver's seat. He was staring off as if he was in deep thought. We were standing on top of a hill, positioned next to the driveway, which allowed a full view of the campsite and driveway. "Are you leaving soon?" my mom shouted, waving her hand. In my head, I had kind of thought that she would have to yell a few times to get his attention. But as soon as the words exited her mouth, his head snapped towards us, as if he had known we were there for the entire time. He tilted his head down slightly and shook his head. He had a scowl on his face. It was pretty clear he did not want us there. that we all walked back up and got in the car. He was a little sketchy, but we all assumed he was simply a grumpy old man who wanted his privacy. So we set off to find a different pull-out spot. We were eventually able to find a large spot with room for all of our tents. There was also a nice swimming hole in the river. It was right on the road, which wasn't optimal, because whenever someone drives by you on that old dirt road, it brings up a hell of a lot of dust. But this wasn't a huge issue, as, besides the orange car guy, we hadn't seen a single other soul. Everything went normal for until the second of 5 nights we were camping. Most of this normal time consisted of us doing normal camping things, walking around the woods, swimming in the river, hanging out. Everything besides the orange car guy incident been completely unassuming. It was the second night and we were all laughing and having fun. I should probably say that when you are camping, random noises coming from the outskirts of your campsite is almost never a cause for concern. After all, you are in the woods. There will be animals. On our first night, there had of course been the usual, almost ambient noises around the campsite. Twigs snapping, an owl hooting, and of course the constant flow of water from the river. But the second night was different. There were footsteps. Not for long, but there were footsteps. "Wait," I said, holding my hand up. "Have I watched the Blair Witch Project too many times, or did I just hear footsteps?" I said. We all waited. Nothing. Everyone else resumed talking, but I started thinking. I started to think the worst, something most people are prone to when out in the middle of the woods with nobody besides your family around. We still had not seen anybody besides the guy in the orange car. The first thing my mind went to was the fact that we could be dealing with a stalker. Unlikely. I thought to myself, we haven't seen anybody else besides the guy in the orange car. However, that could just mean that they are really good at what they do. We would have heard their footsteps earlier. Thought, or maybe that was just the first time that they fumbled. No, I thought to myself. I have been up here nearly 16 times before, and nothing has ever happened. We are in Washington, for God's sake, not Texas. I calmed myself down and began conversing with the rest of my family again. Worrying will only make it worse, I thought. After about 45 minutes, we all stopped, hearing the footsteps again, this time louder. Everybody could hear them this time, not just me. The footsteps started to speed up and get quieter, as if they were running away. Everybody just sat in silence and listened, until finally, they were too quiet to hear. They had clearly known that we had noticed them. Everybody stared at each other in horror. This had gone from 0 to 10 very quickly. Everybody was spooked. But we eventually decided to just go to bed, hoping that they had realized there was 6 people in the camp spot. I know it was a dumb decision, but we had packed a lot for the trip and didn't want to give it up. Eventually, we decided to go to bed. By the time we were all in our tents, it was about 12:30 in the morning, based off of our small watches. We were using watched as we were trying to avoid using phones. It's a camping trip, not a glamping trip. At about 4 a.m., again, based on my watch, I got up to use the bathroom, or I guess use the tree. I chose a tree right behind our tent in clearing of sorts. It was maybe 50 feet behind our tent, so it wasn't like I was in the middle of the woods or anything. I had brought a flashlight with me. I get to the tree and turn it on. I point it at a large rock face, and I of course see my shadow and the shadow of the tent. Just a second later, another shadow steps into view. I whip my head around faster than I ever had before, and just barely see an old man in his 40s to 50s, bolting into the woods at a suspiciously high speed. I point my flashlight in the direction he had ran in, but he was already long gone. I ran back to my tent so fast. I must have covered the whole 50-foot difference in about 2 to 3 seconds. I unzipped the tent and jumped into my sleeping bag. I was shaking and breathing so hard that I am pretty sure I passed out instead of actually falling asleep. I awoke and belted out the entire story to the 5 other people there and begged that we leave. Of course, they didn't believe me. You sound like the main characters from a slasher flick. I screamed in a fit of fury and fear. I wanted to run back to town myself, but of course that wasn't really an option considering what had happened the previous night. Can we at least go into town for a few hours to get more, Supplies or something? I begged, quite literally getting on my knees and pleading. It might sound like I was overreacting, but again, knowing someone is stalking you when you are in the middle of the woods by yourself is not a good feeling, and any reasonable person would have a similar reaction to me. Yes, fine, my mom responded. We got in the car and drove to town. While we were in town, I was able to calm down a little, but I was still dreading returning to the campsite. I was of course considering running now that we were in town, but I couldn't leave my family to camp there, and the man clearly had a car. An orange one. I wouldn't doubt he would follow me if I tried to run. It is a strange feeling, being in a town, out in the open, but not being able to ask for help, or run out of fear of a person that you have never even fully seen. I was also forced to keep all these feelings to myself, as there is no way in hell my family would ever believe me. I was living in a state of paranoia, not sure if I could even call the cops or call anyone for that matter. They could have been watching me. It was a crazy feeling, an indescribable feeling. I was feeling more and more like I had hallucinated everything the previous night, but also feeling more and more unsure about what I should do. I thought about this as we got back into the car and as we started driving back to the campsite. I was behaving normally on the outside, but my mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles per hour. I knew there had to be some way, but I was just too scared to even do anything. Then it all started to go downhill. At some point on our drive back, my dad had taken a wrong turn, and we ended up driving up a logging road. As we drove up the logging road, we slowly realized that we had taken a series of wrong turns. There was a few dilapidated cabins and strange structures, such as wells. That was normal for the area. Eventually, we all realized that we had no idea where we were, and it was getting dark. What should we do? My mom asked, sounding panicked. We have one more tent in the back of the car that we hadn't set up yet. We also have 2 airbeds. We might have to inflate them with our mouths. She responded. At this point, we were all freaked out. We hadn't even been driving for that long, and it was already almost dark out. Nobody remembered taking a wrong turn anywhere either. It was like we were just going back to our campsite. Everything normal. Well, to everybody else, I was still very scared. And then the next moment, we have no idea where we are. It was so creepy. We eventually pulled over and set up a small campsite that was really just a tent with airbeds we blew up by mouth. I got into the tent before the rest of my family did. They were all trying to figure out what to do, and I was just so done and wanted it to be day again. At some point, I fell asleep and awoke at some point during the night. I could still hear the rest of family whispering. Then, out of nowhere, something absolutely horrifying happened. I felt a blade scraping along my stomach. I was lying face down on the airbed. There was somehow a man inside of my airbed. I immediately jumped up and ran outside, screaming, not even wondering what I'm wondering right now. How the hell did he fit in there, let alone get in there? I screamed and was at a loss for words. I just pointed at the tent as my uncle shined his flashlight at the tent. Of course, there was a silhouette. "Get to the car," he said. We all ran to the car and tried to open the doors. They were locked. We then realized that we were not trying to open our car. Our car was gone. It was an orange car. Everything from this point on is a blur. We just ran so far, all the way into town somehow. We stopped at the store. There was nobody around, no cars driving on the streets, just an empty parking lot and nothing else. The next thing I remember was waking up in a cabin, tied to a chair with the rest of my family around in a circle. I am sure there is more that happened. How we obviously somehow got kidnapped while hyperventilating in the Safeway parking lot, but I don't remember any of that. It was all a blur. I also have a feeling that I would rather not remember any of that. Anyways, we were all tied to several chairs in what seemed to be a cabin with masked people all around us. They were holding a single orange. One eventually removed their mask. It was the man that was sitting in the orange car. It reminded me of some cult scene from a movie. "You came here at the wrong time," the man said in a monotone voice. "We were here at the right time." The rest responded, all in the same voice, all in unison. "You cannot escape," the man said. "We will always be free." The rest responded in the same way. This went on for a very long time. I saw the sun rise and set. The phrases went from being somewhat cohesive sentences to being completely random gibberish. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Nobody else did either. We all just sat there, as if in some sort of trance, until finally, they untied me, and me only, and then left the cabin. I whipped around to talk to the rest of family. Well, actually, I wasn't even sure if I could. My mouth was dry. I hadn't had a sip of water in so long. Again, I turned around. They were all gone. Instead, sitting in each chair was a super creepy sculpture with orange skin, a wide smile, and bloodshot eyes. This was it for me. I just ran again, through the dark. I eventually heard footsteps following me. I didn't dare to stop or look back. My lungs were drying out, and I was about to collapse. I then jumped into the freezing cold river and ran downstream through swimming holes, taking sips of water as I went. It felt like nothing even mattered. I don't even remember what happened. In fact, past when we started heading back from town, I don't remember much at all. I have a small memory of somehow finding a bus stop and getting on. I probably looked slightly deranged, but here I am now, typing this from my phone, which luckily has both a waterproof case and is waterproof itself. I am sitting on a bus. I don't know where it is going, and I don't care. I am looking out over a hill as the sun is rising, and atop the hill is a lone orange tree. The night is still young, and there are more horrors to uncover. Let's move on to the next unsettling story. I followed the women to the cemetery, and what I discovered left me terrified. The village where my grandparents lived felt like a world apart, nestled 60 miles from the city where I spent most of my days. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, almost like it had forgotten to move forward. I remember the long, winding trips during the summer holidays, leaving behind the noisy city streets and gradually entering a realm of endless green fields, thick forests, and that familiar, comforting silence that only a remote village can offer. This village was more than just a place. It was a piece of my childhood. Small and close-knit, it had around 70 to 80 houses, each one with its own story. My grandparents, like most of the villagers, had lived there their entire lives, tending to the land, raising their animals, and following the same routines that had been passed down through generations. The air was always thick, with the scent of freshly turned earth, mingling with the sweetness of wildflowers that grew along the banks of the wide river, cutting through the village. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, the villagers would gather. Some would sit by the river, their old hands deftly casting fishing lines into the water, while others would play cards or chat in the shade of the ancient trees that dotted the landscape. For them, these moments of leisure were sacred, time to unwind after a long day's work, to laugh and to remember. For me, those summer visits were pure magic. I would spend my days running through the fields, climbing trees, and exploring every nook and cranny of the village, feeling like I was in my own secret world. The village was my playground, and my grandparents' stories were the soundtrack to my adventures. But there was something else, something unspoken that lingered in the air, especially as the sun set. The village, with all its beauty and tranquility, seemed to hold secret whispers of things I didn't fully understand. A little away from the village, where the fields began to stretch out endlessly, there stood an old, large house. It was the kind of house that seemed out of place, too grand and too isolated for such a small village. A family lived there, though they weren't well connected with the rest of the villagers. People rarely spoke of them, and when they did, it was always in hushed tones, as if there was something about that family, about that house, that was better left unmentioned. The house itself was a mystery to me. From a distance, it looked imposing, almost as if it were watching over the fields and the village. Its windows were always dark, and the fields around it were overgrown, as if nature was slowly reclaiming the land. I would sometimes catch glimpses of movement near the house, shadows flitting behind curtains, or figures walking near the edge of the property, but no one ever seemed to go there, and no one ever seemed to leave. I was endlessly curious about the house and its inhabitant. Despite my relentless inquiries, my grandparents and the villagers would always change the subject when I brought it up. The tension in their voices and the uneasy glances they exchanged whenever the topic arose were enough to tell me that the house and its residents were a matter best left untouched. One particular detail about the house piqued my curiosity even further. On new moon nights, I would see two women leaving the large, mysterious house. They would emerge quietly, their movements deliberate and shrouded in secrecy. Each woman carried a covered basket, its contents concealed by a cloth. The basket swayed gently as they walked, their steps barely making a sound on the damp earth. The women moved with careful grace, their paths illuminated only by the soft, flickering glow of lanterns they carried. The light from the lanterns cast long, eerie shadows on the ground, making the fields and trees around them seem to shift and writhe in the darkness. I would watch from a distance, hidden among the trees or behind thick hedges, trying to remain unseen. The air was always thick with anticipation and the occasional rustle of leaves as the women walked purposefully through the darkened fields. Their destination was a small cemetery located a little way from the village, near the river. This cemetery was ancient, its gravestones weathered and cracked with age. The cemetery's entrance was overgrown with vines and brambles, giving it an air of neglect and forgotten memories. The graves, some partially sunken or obscured by wild grass, seemed to merge with the surrounding forest, making the entire area feel as if it was part of another world. I often wondered what the women did once they reached the cemetery. Each time I tried to follow them, the darkness and the secrecy of their actions thwarted my effort. I would creep closer, my heart pounding in my chest, but the heavy night air and the dense foliage seemed to conspire against me, keeping me hidden, but always too far away to see clearly. The women would disappear into the shadows of the cemetery, and I would be left with a sense of haunting curiosity and unease. The ritual of their visits, the way they moved with such purpose, and the secrecy surrounding their actions made the cemetery seem even more enigmatic. It was as if the place held a dark secret, something tied to the old house and its mysterious occupants, a secret that was just beyond my reach, but ever present in the whispers of the village. On one particularly dark new moon night, I decided to follow them more closely than before. I crept along behind them, careful to stay in the shadows and keep my footsteps silent. As they approached the cemetery, I found a hidden spot among the dense undergrowth, where I could watch them unobtrusively. The women stopped at a large banyan tree standing at the edge of the cemetery. Its gnarled branches and thick roots made it an imposing figure against the night sky. The women placed their baskets gently on the ground before the tree. They then stepped back and began to chant softly, their voices mingling with the rustling of the leaves and the distant murmur of the river. Their prayers were inaudible to me, but the reverence in their tone was unmistakable. After they finished their prayers, they picked up the empty baskets and turned to leave. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if the act of leaving was part of a ritual itself. Later they used disappear in darkness. The baskets were always full of baked meat, fruits, vegetables, and flatbread. But I could not shake the feeling that something more significant was happening there. The women's actions, the silent prayers, and the solemnity with which they performed their ritual created an atmosphere of deep mystery and unease. The cemetery, with its ancient graves and overgrown vegetation, seemed to hold its breath in the presence of their ritual. I returned to the village each time with more questions than answers, the sight of the banyan tree and the echoes of the women's prayers lingering in my mind. It was clear that whatever was taking place at that tree was tied to the house and its inhabitant. The full extent of the mystery remained just out of reach. A few days after my latest observation of the two women's ritual, I was spending time with my friends in the village, enjoying the carefree days of summer. We played games in the fields and shared stories under the shade of the banyan tree. It was during one of these lazy afternoons that an old, disheveled man came shuffling down the village path. His clothes were tattered and stained, and his hair hung in unkempt strands around his face. He had a wild look in his eyes, and his mutterings were often incoherent, giving him an unsettling presence. Villagers referred to him as the old lunatic. He was known to wander the village, mumbling to himself about strange things and occasionally ranting about the family living in the big house. His words were always vague and fragmented, making it difficult to discern any clear meaning from his ramblings. On this particular day, he seemed especially agitated, his voice rising in a fervent tirade as he spoke of the family and a man who had died long ago. Intrigued, I asked my friends about him. They told me that he was a homeless man who lived in the village temple, a place where people provided him with clothes and food out of pity. His past was a topic of hushed whispers and half-forgotten tales. According to the stories, he had once been a servant for the head of that mysterious family who had died decades ago. The family's patriarch was a figure of old, almost mythic proportions in the village. A man and his family members' death had left a shadow over the house. As I listened to my friends, I felt a growing sense of unease. Old Lunatic's connection to the family and his cryptic references to their secrets seemed to add another layer to the mystery that had been haunting me. I wondered if the old man's ramblings held any truth, or if they were merely the product of a troubled mind. His erratic behavior and fragmented stories only deepened the enigma surrounding the family and their darkened house. That evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows over the village, I found myself reflecting on everything I had learned. The old man's vague but persistent mentions of the family, combined with the eerie rituals performed by the two women, left me with a growing sense of foreboding. It seemed as though the more I uncovered, the more the village and its secrets remained stubbornly out of reach, wrapped in a shroud of mystery and silence. A few days after the old lunatic's cryptic rantings about the family, I was on my way to school ground where we used to play football. That old lunatic came in my way. His wild eyes locked onto mine, and he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. In a hoarse, urgent whisper, he warned me to stay away from the family and not to follow them. He hinted that he had seen me on the night I had followed the women to the cemetery, though he never let on how he had known. His warning left me shaken, especially since the family was a topic no one spoke of, and it was unsettling to realize that someone had noticed my secret excursion. Despite his warnings, my curiosity only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something crucial I was missing, something that connected all the strange occurrences in the village. So a few days later, when I headed to the river for a quiet day of fishing, I was startled to see the old lunatic there as well. He was sitting by the riverbank, seemingly lost in thought, but as soon as he saw me, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of recognition and concern. I approached him cautiously, my fishing gear in hand. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "And why did you stop me the other day? What's so dangerous about the family?" The old man looked around to ensure no one else was within earshot before he began to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he seemed to struggle to find the right words, but there was a desperation in his tone that made me listen intently. "That family, they're not like the others," he began, his eyes darting nervously. "They've been involved in things, dark things. The house, the rituals, it's all connected. You saw the women going to the cemetery, didn't you?" I nodded, my heart racing. "They make offerings there," he continued, "but not just for the dead. They're trying to appease something ancient, something that demands a price for peace. The man who died the head of the family, he made a pact with it long ago, and the rituals are meant to keep it at bay. Food, prayers, they're all part of a bargain. It was made." The old lunatic's words sent a chill down my spine. The idea that the family was involved in something sinister and that their rituals were meant to keep an ancient evil at bay was both terrifying and fascinating. The old man's warnings and his fragmented story painted a picture of a family trapped in a dark pact, bound by forces beyond their control. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because you need to stay away," he said, gaze intense. "I saw you that night, and I've been trying to warn you. If you get too close, you might become part of their bargain too. There's a reason they keep to themselves, and why no one speaks of them. Some things are better left alone." The old man's warning left me deeply unsettled, but my curiosity was far from sated. I pressed him for more information, desperate to understand the full extent of the mysteries surrounding the family and their rituals. He sighed heavily, his eyes looking distant, as if he was trying to recall events buried under years of neglect. The house wasn't always like this. He began slowly. Decades ago, it was just a normal, prosperous home. I was a servant there. The head of the house, he was a good man once, but he was consumed by greed. He had 3 daughters and 4 sons, and he was incredibly wealthy. The old man's voice grew more intense. He loved to spend money, and he spent it lavishly. But his greed and poor planning led to disaster. He lost everything. When it came time for his daughters to marry, he begged the villagers for help, promising he'd repay them once he had the chance. He borrowed from many people, but after the weddings, he never paid back a single penny. He drank heavily and offered excuses. But the truth was, he had no intention of repaying anyone. His eyes grew darker as he recounted the tale. The villagers stopped associating with him. They cut him off. One night, while returning from the fields, he noticed something strange near the banyan tree by the cemetery. There was a strange, eerie glow coming from beneath it. Curious and desperate, he approached it. The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. He found an old, ornate box buried beneath the tree. When he opened it, he discovered a cache of ancient gold and silver coins, their surfaces etched with mysterious symbols. As soon as his fingers touched the coins, a chilling apparition emerged from the box. The ghost was ghastly and skeletal, its eyes hollow and its presence emanating a palpable malevolence. The old man shuddered. The head of the house was terrified, but the ghost spoke in a voice that was both haunting and persuasive, told him not to be afraid and explained that it was bound to the coins, locked away for years. The ghost offered the coins to the man but demanded a grim bargain in return. The old man's face was pale as he continued. The ghost required that every new moon, the man must provide offerings of food at the cemetery, left at the banyan tree. In exchange, the ghost would allow him to keep the wealth. But there was a dire warning. If the man failed to fulfill this requirement, the ghost would exact a terrible revenge. It would kill him and his family members in increasingly horrific ways, one each year, until they were all dead. The old man sighed deeply. The man accepted the bargain and began performing the rituals. For a few months, he fulfilled the ghost's demands faithfully. With the wealth, he bought a huge field and built a grand house away from the village where his family lived. He spent lavishly on his sons' weddings and indulged their every desire. But the greed that had driven him never truly left, the old man said, his voice growing somber. He began to skip some of the new moon offerings, thinking that the ghost had forgotten or that he was free from the pact. For a while, nothing happened, but the ghost's vengeance was not so easily forgotten. The old man's face was grim as he recounted the consequence. One year, his youngest grandson, a bright and lively child, was discovered dead in a well. It was a horrific sight. The well had been dry for months, but when the boy was found, his lifeless body was submerged in the murky water. His family was devastated, but the cause of his death was shrouded in mystery. There were no signs of foul play or accident, only the eerie, unnatural stillness of the boy's body in the well. He continued, his voice trembling with the weight of his tale. The following year, the man's eldest son met a gruesome fate. His body was discovered in a ghastly state. His head had been found, but the rest of his remains were nowhere to be seen. The head was left in a grotesque display, the look of sheer terror frozen on his face. The search for the rest of his body was fruitless. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. The local authorities were baffled, and rumors of supernatural retribution began to spread. The old man's expression grew darker. Each time the man failed to honor the bargain, the ghost's retribution grew more terrible and more personal. The deaths were not random. They were a reflection of the ghost's wrath and a warning to the man that the pact was far from over. The man's attempts to evade the ghost's demands only deepened the curse, ensuring that his family would continue to suffer for his broken promises. The old man's eyes were filled with sadness as he continued. In his desperation and madness, the man took his own life. He jumped from a cliff, and his body was found in pieces at the base. His death was a grim testament to the ghost's relentless vengeance and his own broken spirit. The widow, now left alone, revealed the truth to her remaining son and the old servant. She told them the full tale of the ghost and the cursed pact. The old servant, fearing for his own life, fled to ensure his safety. Initially, no one believed the widow's story. It seemed too far-fetched, too impossible to be true. The old man's voice grew somber, but within 6 months, the truth became all too real. The widow and her remaining son were found dead in the fields. Both were hanged from a tree, their bodies left in a grotesque display. The fields where they were discovered were eerily quiet, and the sight of their lifeless forms hanging from the branches sent a shiver through the village. The old man's voice grew even more somber. As the deaths and misfortunes continued, villagers began to believe that the family was cursed. They cut off all connections with them, refusing to speak or interact with anyone from the house. The once proud family was now shunned and isolated, their name whispered only in hushed, fearful tones. The old man paused before continuing. The youngest son of the man, understanding the gravity of their situation and the unrelenting curse that had claimed so many lives, decided to take drastic measures. He isolated the entire family from the outside world, ensuring they had no contact with the village or anyone beyond their own walls. The youngest son knew that if there was any chance of breaking the curse and saving his remaining family, his brother, his nieces and nephews, and his sisters-in-law, he needed to take action. He approached the ghost with a desperate plea. He offered to return whatever wealth remained, hoping it might appease the spirit. In his desperation, he promised to fulfill any demands the ghost might have, hoping it would spare his remaining family. The ghost agreed, but with conditions. The 2 women of the family had to provide food for the spirit on every new moon night for the next 2 years. The youngest son had to be there on the last new moon day. The ghost's demands were not modest. It required the offerings to be in large quantity. The son had to ensure that the food was abundant and unceasing as a way to satisfy the ghost's insatiable hunger and maintain the tenuous bargain. The youngest son accepted the terms. For the next 2 years, he dedicated himself to the ghost's demand. Each new moon, his wife and sister-in-laws would prepare and deliver the vast quantities of food required by the spirit, hoping that these offerings would be sufficient to lift the curse and save his surviving family from further tragedy. The old man's tale ended with a note of grim determination. Despite the son's efforts and the sacrifices he made, the shadow of the curse loomed over the family. The weight of their past actions and the ghost's relentless hunger served as a stark reminder of the cost of greed and the consequences of broken promise. As I listened to the old man's story, the chilling reality of the family's plight became all too clear. The curse had transformed their lives into a nightmare of isolation and fear, and the youngest son's desperate attempts to atone for his family's sins highlighted the dark legacy left by their patriarch's fateful pact. The old man's tale lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over the quiet village and its dark history. The youngest son's tireless efforts to appease the ghost continued for 2 long years. Each new moon, he meticulously prepared and delivered the food, hoping to atone for the sins of his family and lift the curse that had plagued them. As the final new moon approached, the son faced the weight of his responsibility with a heavy heart. He made his way to the cemetery one last time, placing the final offering before the ancient banyan tree. The oppressive silence of the night and the cold wind seemed to carry an ominous promise. The ghost appeared, its presence as chilling as ever. The youngest son, worn and desperate, awaited the spirit's response. The eerie glow that had long haunted the cemetery faded, and with it, the ghost's menacing form. The darkness lifted, signaling the end of the curse. In the days that followed, the village saw a change. The house that had once been a symbol of fear and misfortune now stood quietly, its dark legacy seemingly behind it. The surviving family members, though forever marked by their ordeal, began to slowly reintegrate into the village. The once shunned house became a reminder of the high cost of greed and broken promises. The youngest son lived out the rest of his days with a deep sense of remorse and a commitment to honor those lost. Though the family's fortunes were not restored, they found a measure of peace and a chance to rebuild their lives in the shadow of their past mistake. As for me, the chilling account of the cursed family left an indelible mark. The village, with its haunted past and the ominous house on the outskirts, became a place I could never return to. The weight of the story, coupled with the eerie atmosphere that clung to the place, ensured that I never set foot in that village again. The banyan tree by the cemetery stood as a silent witness to the family's trials, a stark reminder of the price of greed and the enduring impact of a broken pact. The tale of the curse became a dark legend, passed down through whispers and hushed conversations. The ghost's retribution had come to an end, but its shadow lingered, a somber reminder of the consequences of actions taken in darkness. And so the village and its haunted house faded into memory, leaving behind a legacy of both horror and redemption, with the echoes of a tragic past lingering in the quiet fields and the silent shadows of the banyan tree.